the mixture in the film between the issue of disease, serious diseases, and what you can master by screening embryos and then choosing not to implant them or to abort them. But these diseases are rather limited. They gave a number of 120 diseases in the film. But there are many other genetic issues that are hardly known. Intelligence or short-sightedness. Nobody knows anything about the genes that are involved in it. It's not a simple system. There are many redundancies, many difficulties in decoding the human genome. It's not because we have managed to sequence the human genome that we actually understand how it fully works. Towards the end of the documentary, then you come back to the point that perfection doesn't mean much, and diversity matters, because diversity is what makes humanity meaningful. But perfection has got nothing to do with biology. Perfection is a different world. Only machines are perfect. If you want to compare human beings, you can be works of art, you can be geniuses, you can be very different, but perfection is nothing more than ideology. Of course, these aspects are not discussed in the film.
But there is a discussion about the question of improvement. And we saw that you can now have embryo screening, you can just avoid implanting those that have diseases. Now with CRISPR-Cas9, we could imagine not even have to screen them or select them, but actually modify them and take out these genetic diseases altogether. And at the moment, you can only really take action on with regard to those 120 diseases that we know. But do you think we could go further than that? Do you think we actually correct these diseases or these misshapen teeth before people are born?
No, this is absolute nonsense. Nobody knows how it happens. For example, the brain is an emerging system that builds itself on the basis of certain genes. But there's also the issue of interaction with the environment. Not everything is genetically determined. Far from it. Of course, CRISPR-Cas9 changes a lot of things. It has been applied to germlines, and that happened, for example, in China last autumn, where, yes, with the Lulu and Nana, two babies that were born, they modified a gene that is a receptor for the HIV virus, so that in theory the two babies would be HIV resistant.
Now, it's also been said that that resistance or that modification could potentially improve their cognitive functions. Is not that true either?
Yes, again, it's complete nonsense. We have seen in mice that when you change this gene with that particular protein, it seems that it might change other things, and it might help some people avoid vascular diseases. But this is not clear at all. Coming back on the issue of intelligence, IQ, it's a big fantasy. You can see in the film this character selling his special donor bank for highly intelligent people. But please, come on. People are fascinated by numbers, by performance these days. But can you measure all the anybody's sports performance by measuring the speed by 100 kilometers, but the performances of a marathon runner or a 100 meters runner are completely different. You can't be good at everything. And it's exactly the same for intelligence. Some people might be more emotional, more mathematics. There's all kinds of intelligence among human beings. It's not. It can't be summed up by an IQ. Ranging from 22 to 120. This is not an argument.
Je reviens à des trucs super concrets. Je suis désolée,
mais j'ai une question technique.
Un gène ne fait pas une seule chose. Donc, quand on s'amuse à recoller un gène qui fait quelque chose, voilà, dans la construction de l'embryon, par exemple, il va faire à la fois peut-être les bras qui poussent et puis des cellules du rein. Donc, si on commence à
arms and different organs. So, if you want to have longer fingers or elegant fingers for playing the piano, mightn't you disturb the way in which your liver functions or something like that?
This is precisely what I was saying earlier. It's very complicated. In Geneva, we've got a world specialist for certain types of genes that command another series of genes that explains how, for example, your hands or limbs grow. In those systems, one gene commands other genes that will express themselves differently according to the environment and in the body of an adult. So maybe you can very slightly improve the memory in mice, but you have no idea about the consequences. Maybe they'll have early Alzheimer's disease. Nobody has got any idea about the consequences. Maybe there are so many complexities that none of us will ever be able to master that. So this idea of controlling everything is just a utopia. It's even, I would say, childish.
Marc Attah, one of the great fears expressed in this documentary is the idea of standardization. Basically, all humans want to be more beautiful, more intelligent, stronger. Is that the idea? Progress is always to do things better. Well, in our minds, progress is always to do things better. That's one thing, but it's also true that what we were saying earlier is true, and that is that we all suffer from exposure to this ideology at school, at home, and this was at the end of the 1990s in particular when we heard that we all had to be perfect. People told us, well, we're not just genes. But when people talk about their soul, spiritual issues, we tend to be a bit uncomfortable, and we try and reduce that to something more tangible. So there's a lot of hypocrisy in the system in which we live. And we want to try to get away from a materialistic existence, because we know that leads to some problems. But then when you talk about spirituality in the West, then everyone feels a bit uncomfortable and says, oh, you're a bit crazy. Let's get back let's get back to something more tangible. So what could really allow for diversity among people, both symbolically and physically? Physically is something we see a bit more easily, but symbolically as well. Could be focusing on the development of the brain. We don't really talk about diversity that much. And in Switzerland, we have the pharmaceutical industry, of course, where a lot of regulators are being produced. I think Prozac, for example, is the best-selling medicine in the United States for adults. At the end of the day, we are saying we want diversity, but at the same time, in all of our behavior, social, economic behavior, we are becoming more and more similar and standardized. So it's not a surprise that a lot of people think that scientists are purely rational, but actually there is a lot of politics and economics involved as well. And it's not surprising that people say the same things as they see in adverts, in European policy, in this ideology which is everywhere. And it's not surprising that scientists don't have any different views. We go around in the same cars, to the same places on holiday, we watch the same shows on TV. That's uniformity. And it's no surprise that that is also true in this area of genetics, because the West is generating uniformity, and we see that in science fiction as well. Science fiction focuses on genetics, the symptom of a Western society which values diversity, but at the same time only allows uniformity to exist.
Yes, homogeneity together with competition, because we live in a very competitive environment. We need to be competitive, and they keep saying your child will be the most intelligent, he'll be doing better than anybody else because you have chosen specific characteristics. And once again, we've realized that it doesn't serve much purpose. So we've got, at the same time, the idea of being normal, and at the same time, you want to be better than the others. There's no idea whatsoever of being in harmony with nature or the environment.
When you hear parents talk about this, isn't the major risk or fear that if that technology exists, and if I don't use it for my children, then people are going to accuse me of deliberately having a child with a difficulty, and I'll be criticized by society. So won't one day we be criticizing parents if they don't use these technologies? It's the same thing today. If you have a child with crooked teeth and you don't pay for a dentist or an orthodontist, then you're told that you're a bad parent because they're not going to find a job properly because of the fact that they have crooked teeth. So the question that the film raises is, aren't people, individuals like you and me, going to be forced to be considered as a handicap because we're going to make superhumans elsewhere? Who wants to reply to that one? Well, that idea that there are a whole lot of different things that are being said, but we are surrounded by people who talk about perfection and utopia. And we see that in transhumanism, for example, which is working on the improvement or the enhancement of the human race. And a lot of people talk about that, but there's a problem, and that is that we are all disabled. Look at the WHO definition of disabled. Being healthy is someone who is completely psychologically and physically perfect. Well, I mean, that's pretty impossible, isn't it? Hardly anyone is like that. And so we look around us for ways of improving our health. And they may be social tools, psychological tools, or even physical tools. And obviously Western medicine since the 1950s, and you could talk about this better than I can, is based on that idea that, okay, you are lacking in magnesium, and so that's a terrible deficiency you've got there. But that's ridiculous. That's nonsense. I mean, look at Rousseau in the 18th century. You need to perfect yourself also morally. That doesn't mean that you're going to be perfect, but it means that you can improve yourself. And in the social contract, which is very tangible, you can try to be slightly better. But be perfect, like in transhumanism, is, I'm afraid, nonsense, because you're going to be using arguments, fallacious arguments, which are ridiculous, because do you feel that you lack in magnesium? Of course you don't. So we don't know how to combat this, and this is going to create these feelings that we need to keep on progressing all of the time, and that's why we have this feeling of competition that we're going to transmit to our children or the children of others as well. Intelligence is a value which tends to be valued, and we're going to transmit to the children. So this idea of perfectibility, which exists since the beginning of modernity, is something we believe in, and that's the strange thing. We believe it, we accept it, and the cost of medicine in Switzerland is going through the roof, and that's because we are slightly responsible for this. It's not just the others believing this. And I think it's very difficult to see how this health utopia, and that's why this document is interesting, is now becoming something which isn't so glamorous. It's a health dystopia in a way, this incapacity to see ourselves as being different, and this idea that we all have to be the same, choosing a child without that being problematic for anybody. We see that in the film. The question is, for these people who have no difficulty in choosing the eye color of their child, the sex, or maybe avoiding some diseases for them, to what extent will they push others into a very difficult situation?
Yes, that's a very big problem, because behind all of this ideology, all these possibilities offered by science, you standardize very clearly human beings, and more people are finding themselves set aside because they're not within the norm. In many fields, medicine improves things, and until very recently, kids that were not growing, following the normal curve for growth were given special medication. But now, in the Western world, we don't see dwarfs anymore because we have managed to avoid that. But now parents would like their kids to be more than 1.60 meters. So then again, we're going towards standardizations. Those who will not have been modified, though those who are just at the minimum or just below the minimum, are being marginalized, and there's a form of intolerance. For example, in the system nowadays, older persons are being, again, discriminated against, because we have no tolerance for things that are starting to dysfunction or to decay. We're looking for perfection. Again, it's another kind of ideal. But we need to be aware that as human beings, we are fallible.
I'd just like to react to that. I like this idea of the machine, which is perfect, or perfectible. There was a philosopher in the 1950s who wrote a text, and that's becoming more and more popular again today. The obsolescence of man, that was written by Gunther Anders in the 1950s, and he said that we managed to make perfect machines. The problem is when you see these perfect machines, they're so perfect that it makes us ashamed. And we feel ashamed, and how is it that these work and we don't? And the intuition that he had in the 1950s there was that we're going to want to become more and more like machines in order to be freed of this shame. Not to become gods, but to become machines and free ourselves from this fallible biology. And that's why today we see more and more people who show that in a society like ours, which values the body, overvalues the aesthetics of the body, you have a symptom of trying to get away from the body, because bodies are so standardized. Then we get away from the body to a certain extent. And we do that in order to stop the body existing, because we're trying to get away from that sensuality. So you have these pictures of bodies, and we all want to be resembling more and more like these perfect bodies that we see in the adverts. David Le Breton, a French psychologist, wrote about how we've never valued the body so much, but we've never tried to get away from the body as much either. So that's what I'm saying. We're trying to focus on the body, perhaps because we are ashamed of it. It's not perfect, and we want to transform it. Because if you want to make your body into something beautiful, you tend to transform it into something like a machine. And who spends all their time in a fitness
de répéter des mouvements de manière machinique pour entraîner le corps à exprimer
they're training in a very machine-like way in order to get away from that imperfect body. So it's quite paradoxical, because you celebrate the body, but then you are ashamed of it as well at the same time. So you're criticizing bodies, and then, you know, everyone's happy with that. You're saying, okay, I'm going back to the fitness once again. Because we're never perfect. And so finding the dignity of a body is something which is very important. That's something I can do myself. It's a huge movement. We need to be able to accept our imperfections. And, you know, instead of saying, oh, look, you're 40, you need to start doing some sport. This is a problem for everybody. And I'm not talking about smoking, because I miss it.
What's is interesting in all this perfection system is the individual aspects. Plus, it's a very big business, and you can see that very well in the film. It's all a matter of individuals, but let's not forget that we're social animals. We live in groups. We need to interact. We have values. We fall in love. We have relationships. We have common values. And although humankind has got many problems, this is more to do with serious discriminations, the climate degradation, the extreme poverty, but these are social and group problems. What makes us exist most is our body, our smells, and the fact that we're all different. And that makes us fall in love with each other, and that gives us lives with a meaning. Here, those technologies would like to completely change what makes us us.
Are there any questions from the audience? I see a lot of hands going up. I'll ask people to send the microphones around the room. Maybe a question from the front here? Right here at the front? Good evening, and thank you very much for this debate. In the film, we see how in different countries you have different numbers of genetic problems on the list for the assisted reproductive technologies. Which doctors or medical bodies decide which diseases should be screened? And maybe is there a possibility of finding an international consensus on that number of genetic mutations that can be screened? Would that start with sex, of course, which is very important? Well, it's true that legislation changes from one country to another, and it changes very fast, depending on when the ethical or political discussion takes place, and that's why there are such disparities between countries. Some countries accept that the sex should be chosen through embryo screening, and other countries don't accept that, and we've only just accepted that to a certain extent. What about the type of disease then that should be screened? Bertrand?
I think things are getting very standardized again. Yes, in Switzerland, it's probably 120 or 130 serious genetic diseases that can lead to abortion, whether it is for embryo screening that has now been accepted by the population. The embryo will not be implanted, but this is not about the choice of sex. What was not mentioned in the film that most embryo screening is done to choose boys. And there is a huge gender gap, especially in Asia, India, for example. In the film, they show that China is very open and is going much further. There's always an issue of rich people being allowed to do certain things. and again discriminating against poorer people. So I think it's a lost cause. They talk about certain red lines, for example, germ therapies, but I don't think we will ever be able to set fixed red lines. And the lines are blurred anyway, because the knowledge changes and progresses. There's an issue of cultural judgment as well. But the issues are the same everywhere. It's the same for environmental problem. There's no need. It doesn't matter having local legislations if you don't have a world action.
On the environment, for instance, isn't this the next stage in the development of humanity? The fact that life on Earth is becoming more and more complex. Haven't we destroyed our environment so much that we know now that we won't be able to turn the clock back? And what about these manipulations, these genetic manipulations? Won't they give us a possibility of creating a better humanity that can resist environmental degradation? Because we currently wouldn't be able to survive it.
Well, I think that's probably a kind of discourse that you hear from people in the Silicon Valley. They believe there's a problem. For each and every human problem, there is a technological solution. So if there is a degradation in climate, whether it is pollution, well, you can change people's genes so that we can adapt. Come on, we have no idea whatsoever. There are things that are detrimental to any kind of human being. For example, radioactivity. DNA is far too fragile in face of radiology. And the main problem is death for human beings. Some people believe that they have the solution with transhumanism, Marquez Sala being the great specialist.
A post-humanity that could survive in an environmentally damaged world. Well, what's funny about the argument about that is that in the 1960s, when you invented the word cyborg, which everyone's heard of now, this mixture between a computer and a man, the reason we did that was that we were in the Cold War. And everyone said, well, imagine if one day we needed to go off into space to live, because the world was destroyed, because people were afraid of that. So we can't live in space currently, so that's why we need to become like cyborgs. Now, obviously, that's not why we have cyborgs today. It's more for pacemakers and that kind of thing. The idea is that we are destroying something, our own world, and then thanks to technology and the industrial system, we can repair the damage that we've done. And that type of thinking no longer deludes anybody apart from the advertising firms, perhaps, because the world is so complex that we can't just, cut with those molecular scissors to cut a few genes out and we'll be okay. So some people might think we just may as well take out all the bad genes and put in the good ones, but it's not that easy. And imagine the secondary, the knock-on effects. It's not like Lego. You don't just take off a yellow brick and put in a blue one. You might feel that because you get all of this advertising and you get all of this discourse, but it's not that easy to change things overnight. The complexity of the system is such, but scientists seem to agree that what the
On arrive à faire des individus qui sont résistants au virus du VIH aujourd'hui, peut-être à un autre virus demain. Et du coup, il y a aussi cette question de la guerre. On va balancer, on va rendre résistant notre population à quelque chose.
Or allies resistant to some virus and then launch the virus on others. That's not science fiction. These are questions for us today.
Yes, that's something we talked about after the Chinese manipulation. Of course, the Chinese government probably allowed it. This is related to the HIV virus, so we'll see what happens with those two children. But if you send the virus in a population, then people that have been transformed will be resistant. It could be the same for other types of viruses. You can imagine that sort of thing. The problem is that, as we were saying, maybe the mutation that has nothing to do with a special disease might have some advantages, some benefits, and might maybe improve some kind of a memory. Maybe, but it probably also has some downsides. A genome is not just a series of letters. It has a meaning. It's like a text. Maybe you can improve the meaning of one sentence, but if you think that you can touch a few things here and there, because one character appears at one point in the story, it appears again later on. Nobody knows the full story of the genome. So basically, human beings are extremely arrogant, just like we were with the environment, with nature. We thought we were so powerful, and then suddenly species disappear and won't ever reappear. We believe we are so powerful, but we don't really know what to do now. So I think we are in a similar situation now with the genome. We are probably much better at manipulating than actually understanding it.
Except what's new now is that with CRISPR-Cas9, we don't need those major technologies now for IVF. The times of Bruce Brown, pretty much anyone can start now messing around with these genes. You can even do it yourself.
Yes, because as we were saying, there's China and the bigger power and the industries that are interested in it as a business. And there are, for example, laboratories in Paris, I've seen that, where people self-hack their own cells. They buy their own kits to work with CRISPR-Cas9 on their own genes. So that's where we're heading. But again, as I was saying, we are much more powerful in changing things than actually understanding them.
Are there any further questions or comments? The microphone is there in the room. Just put your hands up. We still have a little bit of time left for our discussion. Please go ahead.
Vous m'entendez? Oui. On est énormément soumis en fait à la performance.
We hear about performance all of the time. If you look at the future, we are told about enhanced humans, and all of that is towards achieving better performance. Very recently, the Brochet Foundation had a researcher, Valentin Gorina, who thought a lot about human enhancement through prosthesis. And the title of the conference was From Cyborg to Repairable Humans. And what was very interesting in the presentation that you can find on the Brochet website is that, to begin with, she was fascinated by this fantasy of science fiction and enhanced humans, such as athletes, Oscar Pistorius, for example. And there is such a divide between the acceptance of the performances that are achieved through that enhancement, which are only for one particular function. When you manipulate the human genome, you realize that there are various objectives you're looking for, and that's the limit that you are actually forced to face. So you're talking about enhanced humanity through prosthesis or artificial limbs. That's not the same question as messing around with genes. Isn't that true? Well, enhancement of the human race is like a paradigm. You've also got digital changes that you could talk about as well. Some people think that the destiny of humans is to
qui finalement a montré ses limites au cours de l'histoire, c'est-à-dire notre corps.
Get out of the current body and develop a more resistant, stronger body. Think about uploading technologies, for example, because enhancement doesn't necessarily go through biology. It's all of the ways in which we could overcome our limits. With that argument, which is quite difficult to face, which is that people have always tried to improve themselves and adapt their ecosystems, for example.
Une forme d'augmentation,
which is already a form of enhancement. And today, people say, well, yes, but now we are trying to enhance the inside of us, and not just the outside. But
de l'augmentation, c'est-à-dire l'idée de la performance, c'est qu'il y a quand même pas simplement des gens aujourd'hui qui...
Some people, I think, rightly call transhumanism a liberal ideology. Of course, we're focusing on performance. Of course, there's a lot of money at stake. And, it's enough to say, well, you'll live longer, and you won't have to live in suffering. And people fall into that. And I remember the Blue Brain Project, for example.
Avec l'Union européenne sur les maladies mentales, le directeur qui était un type assez à l'époque, qui disait on va résoudre les 600 pathologies mentales. On est tous d'accord.
Mental disease. Of course, we all think that would be a good idea. It would be silly to say, no, we don't like these Americans who want to enhance humanity.
Because if you say, well, look, et on va un jour être capable de modéliser le cerveau pour résoudre.
One day we'll be able to modify our brains. This is what Switzerland would say. Yeah, we're not going to say no. That's utopia. But it's always like that. You sell progress by saying that we're going to solve disabilities or diseases, and the idea behind that is improvement or enhancement. It's a very deep-rooted individualism. It's very 13th, 14th century, actually, more than a 20th century thing. Just to come back to human rights, what this film shows is that these technologies that some people are making money with, or some people are using to achieve their own aims, has also been useful for others. We see the way in which bodies are turned into commodities, and that's a zero progress as well.
What strikes me about enhancement, there's the biological aspect, selection, embryo screening, genetic engineering, or germlines, but there are many other things like medicines or drugs. Many drugs were initially designed to cure diseases, even Viagra, but are now used to increase performances. Medical students, many of them take Ritalin, which is supposed to calm down superactive kids. There are all sorts of drugs, hormones being used, for example, as anti-aging. There are stem cell therapies against certain brain diseases. And then there's the use of machines. This started with prosthetics for knees. First of all, you start by trying to imitate nature, and then you start to go further. Then there were the first implants, like pacemakers. Many people have pacemakers. Then the first brain pacemakers were created to cure, for example, Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. But now you can actually put an implant with electric stimulation to treat depression. And some people are using electromagnetic field cask to stimulate the brain. Some studies seem to suggest that it actually works to stimulate memory. There's all sorts of hybridations. We all sort of half hybrids with our smartphones as well. The other great myth that you were talking about is artificial intelligence, which makes us even more obsolete. We feel like we're not much good when compared to artificial intelligence, and there's the fantasy of transhumanism, how we could become hybrids with the computers and download or upload ourselves.
At the same time, it's true that we tend to underestimate ourselves. But what we hear on a daily basis is that we are constantly being undervalued. Maybe because we're Swiss, but we tend to accept that too easily. In a few years, we're told that computers will be far more intelligent than humans, and we just accept that. We don't even know the limits of our own intelligence. Someone who you don't know says that you're not intelligent compared to a computer, and you just accept that. We develop computers which don't work like people. But you're told that your brain resembles that. And then we're told that these computers are much more intelligent than we are, and you believe that as well. And this is why science fiction is very important, because it helps, it plays with those ideas, and it says to you, so you're not as strong as a computer? Okay, well, let's see how the world will get on with just when it's run with computers. And that's like Terminator. That's the idea you had in the 1980s. Computers, like Terminators, just war machines. And in fact, there are a lot of symbolic discourses out there, some of which aren't very well known. Gattaca, for example. Gattaca talks about the mental alienation we have if people keep on telling us that we're imperfect and we need to be perfect. And that's what happens in the film. He rebels against that discourse. He just says that discourse that keeps on telling people they're not perfect. And we just accept that, but go along with it too easily. Artificial intelligence, we're told. You've all seen that film which talks about artificial intelligence, and people look at that future, and I'll just remind you that the voice from the film, from Scarlett Johansson, the #1 male fantasy, all the men are saying, when is she coming? And she never comes. And so it's the experience of the body. That's what I'm talking about. In the social networks as well, the body's disappeared, and we're all happy with that. We don't want to say,
non mais je lui parle sur les réseaux sociaux, comme si le corps était plus important, comme Scarlett Johansson qui apparaît sacre bleu, jamais.
It's like Scarlett Johansson, you never actually see her in the film. And the film doesn't say, well, the future's dangerous. It says, why do you actually accept this? Why do you accept this poverty? And we say, this is a science fiction film, it's talking about the future, but it's not. The only thing that was predicted is geostationary satellites, which was predicted by Clark, was a scientist working on those satellites. And no other science fiction film predicts the future. They talk about this amazing ability that humans have of underestimating themselves.
Et de ne pas résister là contre.
Et de ne pas résister.
J'aime bien ce que c'est, je crois que c'est Jacques Testard qui dit.
I think Jacques Testard says,
making
a baby in bed under a duvet cover is much more fun than going off and, masturbating in the toilets. Okay, just to conclude, because we're reaching the end of our debate now, I do see one further question over there, so please, I'll give you the microphone.
Merci pour cet intéressant débat.
Thank you very much. A very interesting discussion.
Je voulais simplement savoir.
I just wanted to know, because I recently was reading a journal.
Est-ce que ce qu'on dit là, ça donne de l'espoir? Ça va faire
is that going to bring any hope to disabled people? Or is it the solution that to a question that has no answer yet? Well, I participated in a day organized by Foyer Handicap in Vaud, and there were speakers by teachers from EPFL of new technologies, and the room was full of disabled people. One of them raised his hand, and well, that's all fine and well, but science refuses to pay for a new prosthetic for my knee. I've been waiting for it for years. For me, the main point here, because we're talking about human rights here, is equity. We are seeing extraordinary things, but that are for an elite. In the sphere of disability, of course, there is hope for people, but it will be extremely expensive. Are we going to pay for it for all of them? So yes, there is hope, whether it's for biotechnologies or on the biomechanical front. There are many possibilities, but this will be a major issue for humankind. We will be able to improve things for people. We are capable of many things. Although human beings will still die, we're not able to change that yet. But for me, this is the central issue. And the very same question related to human rights. Well, I forget what I meant to say. Coming back to the issue of disability, recently in France we have seen the cases of babies born without hands or arms, probably due to environmental factors. So quite possibly this could be detected pre-birth, and parents could be prevented from giving birth to disabled people. So because we're talking about human rights, there's that as well. Yes, and of course in that case there may be environmental factors. The other point, what I meant to say earlier, is that if you talk about social media, artificial intelligence, what really frightens me is that this is within the hands of an elite, a small number of people that are extremely powerful. And it is the case for most of these technologies. These people are fascinated by a utopia that is for the elite. A very small group of people are able to control the population. Those who are in control are a very limited percentage of the population.
I see two further questions. The lady over there, and then over that side of the room. Whoever has the microphone, please go ahead. I was wondering if by modifying the genome we can do that all at the same time to deal with the diseases that we face today. Won't we make ourselves more vulnerable to the diseases of the future because we all have the same weaknesses? Well, the answer is yes. Diversity protects us the best from our environment. So all of the viruses and bacteria which are mutating all of the time, if we're all the same genetically, then we might all get killed off all at once during a pandemic. What's our strength is our diversity, actually. It's not uniformity. We see that throughout the living world, in plants and everywhere else. Who has the microphone now? Go ahead.
Plusieurs choses, dont
At the moment, at the university here in Geneva, there's a week dedicated to living together. And tonight I found the film very interesting, but what I felt was more like Frankenstein 2021 or 2050. Frankenstein, which is very disturbing, very frightening. So I thought it was interesting to see that this would be very useful in many areas, for example, for disabilities, but at the same time, we're going towards more business, more benefits, more profits, as always. So we're heading for the wall.
Yes, you see that all over the place. You always have pros and cons, and I think you're right about that. Are there any further questions or remarks? I just wanted to come back to that point about how the human race needs or has this temptation to try and adapt their environment rather than adapting to its environment. And isn't that the strength that we have, is that we think that we can control our environment? And what might actually lead to our extinction fairly quickly as a species. So is humanity in the process of killing itself? Well, I'm not. I think your question is an interesting one, and your comment is a very interesting one, because I don't know how you could really reply to that question. Individually speaking, you can try to interpret the world, and I don't know if you can count 8 billion people, how you can do that, because what you're saying is symptomatic of what we hear very often in the second half of the 20th century at any rate, which I believe is fairly dangerous, and that is that we have this capacity to continue to criticize ourselves. Rappelez-vous, dans Matrix, c'est ça, vous êtes des virus. Talking about the fact that we are viruses, we're going to kill ourselves. Remember Matrix? A lot of people talk about suicide in environmental circles. Humans are so stupid that they're destroying their own environment. There are so many of us, though, so we are actually doing well at something. But I think what you said earlier was very interesting, and I think it's maybe time not to try to develop utopia, or Silicon Valley dreams, but to get back to basics, and that is we should stop criticizing ourselves all the time, saying how stupid we are and how we are killing ourselves and destroying our environment and machines are better than us, because I believe that that is an ideology. And I believe that that is something that we hear too much in different groups, parties. People say, look, oh, humans, they're useless. You may as well just go off to Mars to live because we've stuffed up our own planet. And it doesn't give people other possibilities. People end up saying, oh yeah, okay, yeah, it's true, we're hopeless. And we see enough American films when at the end of the day in the Planet of the Apes, for example, the apes survive and the humans all die because humans are such idiots. But actually humans aren't just idiots. And I wonder where you see that in the media today. Because I think we should be teaching young people that humans aren't such idiots after all. Okay, we've destroyed the ecosystem to a certain extent, but it's so complex that we're not entirely sure if we actually led to that destruction. So please, I would like to say that it's important as well to try to think less negatively. Think less in those binary terms about perfection and being useless. There are probably more practical, open-minded aspects about how it's important to have community, because we're here and we live together. Could we try to imagine or predict what these technologies are going to lead to in the years to come? Bertrand Kiffard, to conclude.
No, no, you can't predict. But I am still very confident in human beings. What frightens me most is, first of all, that Not that machines take over human beings, that's another fantasy, but that we turn ourselves more and more into machines because we're so fascinated by them, and this is already happening. We are formatting our minds and trying to function like machines. My other great fright is domination by elites from the Silicon Valley together with their ideologies. And we need to oppose that. The other thing that we saw in the film was also the acceptance that some people do have money, they can pay for anything they want, they can buy a womb, they can buy sperm. We won't survive without a human rights vision, without respect for each other. That's one of our characteristics as human beings, and that cannot be erased. We need to defend it. Absolutely. Yes, and plead for diversity. Thank you everyone. Thank you to both of you. I wish you a very good evening, and thank you as well to the organizers. It's always with a sense of shame. I've always been the one to blame for everything I lost.